Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, Jacob Rees-Mogg has become perhaps the unlikeliest star of the current Parliament, the darling of Conservative Party conference, the subject of an online fan movement known as Mogmentum, and currently bookies' favourite to succeed Theresa May as next leader of the party. Now, if you're one of those who feels they're just not hearing enough from the MP for North East Somerset, then I have good news. He's agreed to take part in a fortnightly podcast for the website Conservative Home, called, perhaps inevitably, the Moggcast. Let's have a listen to him discussing one of the biggest domestic challenges facing the government.
The other obvious area is the health service, which is clearly under strain during the winter flu outbreak. But in reality, austerity in the NHS for 7 years of 1% real increases is against what has happened in its previous history, and is going to be very hard to continue with, however much there are limited resources.
Well, that was Jacob Rees-Mogg, or the voice of, and Paul Goodman from the website Conservative Home joins us now. So is this Moggcast just Jacob Rees-Mogg speaking? I mean, is there any debate? Is there any, you know, what actually happens?
Oh, I do talk to him.
You
it's
do?
A conversation
It is a conversation.
Him and I, or Mark Wallace and I. Mark is my other co-worker on Conservative Home. We did think of offering him a column. We have to cover the whole Tory landscape, and he's one of the most arresting and distinctive figures on that landscape. And of course, we could have done that. Anna's other colleague, Nicky Morgan, has a column, and we could have offered one to him. But I thought, no, what he's best known for, that he writes perfectly well, is his speaking. So I'll sit down with him once a fortnight and discuss the NHS. He wants a bit more money for it. Housing, he's all in favour of more building on the green belt, if necessary, which might surprise. And Brexit, where, more predictably, he thinks the House of Lords shouldn't hold up the withdrawal bill.
Right. What's the most revealing thing he's said so far to you?
The most revealing thing so far, and it did come as a slight surprise to the audience, and I think it's being picked up a bit, is that he said it's going to be very hard to sustain NHS spending at this level rather than increase it, given the pressures on the service. And that will surprise some, because he's seen as a figure who's very much on the right of the party, but he dropped a broad hint about that, so we've gone with that as the main lead.
Have we reached peak Mogg, in your mind?
I've no idea.
Well, what do you think? I mean, are you pleased to be hearing more of him on podcast, or not?
He doesn't represent the Conservative members in my constituency, or indeed Conservative voters.
Right.
He has obviously he's an important player. He's a delightful man, but I don't think that I would like people to think that Jacob represents the modern-day Conservative Party.
So why is he so popular with so many members?
I don't know where the evidence is for that.
Is he popular with Conservative members?
According to our survey, yes, we have a 1,300 monthly panel. I think it's pretty solid. So, for example, 70% of them last month lined up behind the Prime Minister's EU deal that she signed at Christmas. So, you know, it's not a bunch of raging Brexiteers.
Anybody can. But your website, quite rightly, is open to everybody. And if you look at the comments on it, there are a large number of people who are not members of the Conservative Party who put comments on it. So to do polls based on...
That's the classic mistake, if I may say so.
Do please enlighten me.
I will. Of mistaking about 30 people who comment for the thousands of people who read it each day.
But they're not necessarily members of the Conservative Party.
No, not necessarily at all.
It's really
but my argument on the poll really is this. Look at the results. If it was UKIPers or very hardline Brexiteers, you'd have 70% of those who respond coming out against the Prime Minister's deal. Whereas, in fact, 70% of them, 7 in 10, I'm sure it's the same sort of view in your association, you'll tell me, were lined up behind the Prime Minister's deal.
And he was the darling of the party conference. I mean, he was sort of mobbed.
What's the basis on which you say that? Because a lot of people went to a fringe meeting.
Yeah, and they were packed with support. Weren't they Conservative Party members?
But most Conservative Party members do not go to Conservative Party conference because, in my association, most of them are actually at work.
Well, Graham Brady, the man who would obviously oversee a Conservative leadership contest, has said he doesn't think Mr Rees-Mogg is a viable candidate for Prime Minister. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think Jacob said that himself, hasn't he? He said, you can't come straight from the back benches to be Prime Minister. And I think he's right. I find it quite hard to imagine Jacob as Prime Minister, though you never know. But I think Anna's right in one sense. Look, if we had the website 7 days a week, and all we had was Jacob Rees Mogg, this would be most unrepresentative of what members think. You've got to have a mix. That's why we have, you know, for example, Nicky Morgan, I think, works quite closely with Anna. That's why we have Garvin Walsh, who's a big critic of Brexit.
But has he been given too much of a platform, do you think,
Yes,
for views?
because you guys love it, because it gives you a story, which I don't criticise. That's your job. I know to be a journalist, so I understand these things. But he does not represent the majority of Conservative voters, for sure. His views on abortion, for example, are deeply upsetting and troubling to many of us, both women, Conservative women and Conservative men. And they don't represent Conservative voters or Conservative members.
Right,
and that's very important
Do you
to
accept
remember.
that? Has he been given too much of a platform? Yes or no?
It depends what you're trying to do. If you're a website trying to get readers,
Exactly.
of course you'll have it, or you'll have Nicky Morgan to get up your ratings.
And on that note, we have to end the show.
The EU has been sounding both tough and tender as regards Brexit today and yesterday. In a speech to the Parliament today, the President of the Council, Donald Tusk, did the tender bit.
Wasn't it David Davis himself who said, if a democracy cannot change its mind, it ceases to be a democracy? We, here on the continent, haven't had a change of heart. Our hearts are still open to you.
Yearning for us to come in or come back. But the tough bit seems to be facing us in the next round of negotiations. This is actually when it was, I suppose, meant to be the most straightforward, agreeing the terms of a transitional arrangement. Well, the draft instructions on that issue from the member states to Michel Barnier appear to be pretty hard line on what the transition will look like. Forget the idea that we'll set our own fishing quotas in our seas during that transition, for example. Seems to be a sort of race to the top between the member states, each piling their own issues into the EU negotiating mandate. Well, Nick, what political editor is back with me? Nick, why did Michel Barnier come out today with that kind of our heart is open to you still?
Well, it was Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, and sometimes you need to set his words to music. But what he was saying was music to the ears of a small number of Remain supporters who are seeking to reverse Brexit. Not a soft Brexit, no Brexit. And what they need is Brussels, Donald Tusk, Michel Barnier to say, we would like to have you back. And the reason why they need that is that by the time of the autumn when we will have this deal, they want the British people to see two options on the table: the new deal or the existing membership. And they're talking about various ways in which you could reverse Brexit, defeating the government in the House of Commons or tabling another referendum to that bill when it goes through the House of Lords.
Is this going to happen?
Well, I was speaking to a member of the Cabinet who's a Remain supporter who said you couldn't envisage this happening unless public opinion shifted dramatically. 60-40 in favour of Remain, 19 months on for the referendum. It's not really shifting.
Nick, thanks. Well, one of the most vocal supporters of Brexit has been the Tory backbencher Jacob Rees Mogg. He was rewarded for his work in this area today by being appointed chairman of the party's influential European Research Group, a sort of internal lobbying grouping which works to push for a hard Brexit. I spoke to him earlier today and I put it to him that despite President Tusk's comments, the EU was preparing to be pretty tough and uncompromising for the next round of negotiations.
I'm all in favour of them being tough and uncompromising. I want a proper Brexit. I want us to leave the European Union, heart, soul and mind. I don't want us to have a sort of Brexit where, because they've given us all sorts of baubles, we have stayed in bits that deny us freedom. The key thing is coming up with the trade negotiation now. It is so important that we maintain the flexibility to do deals with other countries, that we're not so bound in by the EU's requirements that we can't get the benefits of cheaper food, clothing and footwear that will flow from setting our own trade relationships. So their being tough may actually push us into a clearer Brexit.
Can we talk about the transition? Because the government is pretty keen on a transition or implementation. The EU, all the signs are, from the draft negotiating positions, they're going to be really tough.
Well, I think the language is really important. Is it an implementation period, which the government is asking for, or is it a transition? If it's an implementation period, we have left the EU and we are implementing the consequences. That is to say, it may take time to put in new immigration queues at Heathrow, and until that's done, we're implementing. If it's a transition, we are in fact still in the European Union. If they set our fishing quotas, if new laws coming from the EU affect the UK, if the ECJ still has jurisdiction, it would be untrue to say we had left. It would be an extension of our membership, and if that's what the government wants to do, it should do it under the terms of Article 50 and be honest about it. It would be a deceit to have a transition that kept us in the EU for 2 years by default.
Right. And you wouldn't necessarily be against extending our membership for 2 years to get everything sorted out, but you want honesty about that if that's what the plan is. Because the EU, by the way, is in no doubt at all. It is extension of membership by another name.
I would be opposed to extension of membership. An implementation period is fine. A transition period is not. The Prime Minister, who I fully support, has been very careful to say an implementation period.
But she just uses the language you know is going to appeal to you.
No, she
and
doesn't.
Business just hears transition arrangement. They don't make any distinction at all.
It's very important to focus on the details. The Prime Minister is a person of great precision. She doesn't use language loosely. And she has invariably said implementation, and she has said that we will leave on the 29th of March 2019. And I fully support her position.
Right. I mean, I wonder how you interpreted Nigel Farage's comments on a second referendum, because that again was seen by some as a kind of a sign of nervousness on the Brexit side, that it's just slipping away potentially.
I don't know why Mr Farage decided to say he wanted a second referendum. One of the really interesting things about polling on this at the moment is that people are broadly unchanged from where they were in the referendum. But on the question, do you want another referendum, everyone in this country is Brenda from Bristol. There is no appetite for another referendum. And as it happens, I think there would be real anger if there were a second one, because we're not one of those smaller EU states that when we vote to give the answer that the EU doesn't like, get told to vote again and again until we do as we're told, like good little boys. And therefore I think if there were a second referendum, you would see considerable popular discontent.
You're now running the ERG, the European Reform Group. It's about 60 Tory MPs on the more Brexit side, let's say. Are you going to hold the government's feet to the fire on all the things we've been talking about, the government's determination to go for a clear Brexit rather than a slightly messier, softer one?
The ERG is a group of like-minded members of Parliament, and it provides research to help us with work on European issues. I am very keen to help the government achieve the policy that it set out, and that the Prime Minister set out particularly in the Lancaster House speech, and to encourage a vigorous implementation of that policy. The government has my personal complete support in doing that.
Jacob Rees Mogg, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.